Good morning, everybody. I'm Ram Khoury, Director of the Issam Fares Institute at AUB, and we're very pleased to have you here for this event, which is a part of our Research and Policy Forum on Climate Change and Environment in the Arab world. This is an ongoing program that we launched last year as one of several ongoing programs at the Issam Fares Institute to look into important public policy issues and to bring together researchers in the region with colleagues from abroad and to do high-quality integrated research and to bring the fruits of the research into contact with policymakers throughout the region. Policymakers defined widely, including government people, private sector, NGOs, international agencies, foreign donors, education system, media, all the actors who feed into making public policy. And here we're basically only hosting this event. We weren't involved in the production of this report, though we did meet with the authors several times, and Nadeem Farjalla, who's the faculty research director of our Climate Change Research and Policy Forum, met with them as well. But we are planning to follow up this report and other activities that we've been involved with a series of events now that we'll be hosting at AUB in the coming 9 months. A major program on climate change and health, which our institute is doing with the Faculty of Health Sciences and with support from IDRC, we expect. We've been talking with them about that. That long-term research program for many years looking at the linkages between health and climate change. We've already started the research on that, the Faculty of Health Sciences. And then we've started a program already on food systems in the Arab world through the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences, looking at the linkages between climate change, environmental change, and food, availability, price, quality, etc., the impact of food, and rural communities that produce food. And then we'll be looking at water issues throughout the coming years. Water is one of the strengths of AUB, water engineering issues. And of course the political security, international relations issues. So we've got 5 or 6 themes now that we've already identified, which are actually very nicely mirrored in this report, which it was quite a nice thing to see. And it's no surprise, anybody who looks at this issue and is honest about it will realize that there are 5 or 6 major themes that need to be addressed, including demographic change. One of our new long-term programs is migration in the region, which we've started addressing through research and meetings. So we're very pleased to host this meeting, and we will keep you informed of other activities that we do. With that, I just want to thank you all for coming and thank the participants and introduce the participants, and then I will get off the stage and they will continue. The Danish ambassador in Lebanon, Christensen, has been very active in this area, and the Danish Embassy, the Danish government are leaders in the world in climate change issues, as you know. He will make a few comments, and then Dr. Mutasem El Fadel, next to me, is a professor at AUB, has been working on water issues since the early Bronze Age, I think, about 3,000 years ago, has a extensive knowledge of water and engineering issues. Farah Salka from IndyACT is one of their managers and leaders in the programmatic field. IndyACT is an NGO that's very active in advocacy for climate change, especially climate change policies. We've done some work with them, conferences and meetings. And this signifies as well our desire to bring together all the different sectors, government, researchers, private sector, international agencies, and NGOs. And then Ollie Brown from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Ollie is the main author of the report, and he was involved with the team that spent months and months working on this. So I will turn it over to Ambassador Christensen for his comments, and then we will have comments from the 3 speakers, and then we'll have an open discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rami. On behalf of the Danish government, I'm pleased to welcome you to this launching event today. We are here today to launch an important new report on the links between climate change and security. The report has been commissioned by the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and conducted by the International Institute for Sustainable Development. First, I want to thank the panelists for taking the time to help getting attention to this event, and I hope that will get a lot of press coverage, so the message will get around. Second, before getting into details, I would like to express my very warm thanks to our co-hosts, IndyACT and Issam Fares Institute. Without your immense help and support, we would not have been able to organize this event today. In addition, we are impressed by the seriousness both co-hosts on a more permanent basis are putting into the work with the consequences of climate change. I will specifically mention IFI's Research and Policy Forum on Climate Change and Environment in the Arab World. This program boasts 35 AUB faculty members whose research and publications encompass a wealth on climate change and environmental issues. IFI's climate change program actively engages a myriad of climate-oriented think tanks and policymakers. And IndyACT is a remarkable organization. IndyACT, as a civil society-based organization, plays a key role in awareness building regarding climate change, not only in Lebanon, but also in the region as such, through its network and through a multitude of activities. And IndyACT positively and actively participates in current UN negotiations in Bonn for a new climate change agreement that is supposed to be out in December of this year. Let me provide you with a bit of context why we are here today for the launching of the report. The government of Denmark believes that climate change is one of the most serious threats facing the world, reducing the availability of water, threatening the production of food, undermining economic growth, and threatening the very existence of some parts of the world, including small island states, large delta areas, farmland turning into arid land. Most of you present here today, I suppose, are very well aware of the fact that Copenhagen in December this year will be hosting the World Conference, UN Conference on climate change. We are hoping the world will come together to agree on an ambitious text on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to replace the Kyoto Protocol that would be running out in 3 years in 2012. We do realize that the developed world bears a major responsibility to mitigate greenhouse gases, as developed countries are the countries that have produced most greenhouse gases. But we also have to work together to address a problem that affects all of us. The Middle East is one of the regions that will be most affected by the impact of climate change. We know that, it's a given fact. However, the consequences of this fact do not appear to be fully known and understood by all in the region, neither people nor governments. Let me give you a few words why the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs commissioned IISD to write a report on climate change and security in the Middle East. The Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs wanted to have a closer look at how climate change would have an impact on the stability of the region and commissioned IISD to do the report. IISD is a highly respected and independent policy research organization based in Canada and who has been working on issues of climate change for 15 years and security for some 10 years. The IISD people traveled in the region interviewing experts, politicians, academics, etc., and saw some 100 people expressing their views, coming up with their knowledge about the dynamics within this problem. This report that we have in front of us today, and those of you that have not got it, it's still available behind you, is a unique report, since it's the first time that a report looking at these issues in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and the OPT has been produced. The report is unbiased, it's trying to be as objective as possible. It is not a campaigning report leading up to the conference in Copenhagen. The Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs gave free hands to the authors to say what they wanted. There has been no editorial control on that. Therefore, the opinions expressed in the report do not necessarily reflect official Danish policy. Having the report in front of me today gives me great pleasure. It's a great pleasure to launch this report, and we look forward to continuing the discussion on how best to work together to combat the challenges of climate change and secure a sustainable peace in this all too often troubled region. Before concluding, let me once again express my warm thanks to the two co-hosts, IndyACT and Issam Fares, for making the launch possible today. I and the Danish Embassy in Beirut appreciate very much having you as active partners in our work here in Lebanon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think what we'll do now is the Ambassador and I will get off the stage and leave it for the three principal speakers, and they will each make their presentations, and then we will have an open discussion.
Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Faculty of Engineering. And Mr. Ambassador, friends and colleagues, I'd like to welcome you all. When I looked at the title, Rising Temperatures, Rising Tensions, then coupled with climate change and violent conflict in the Middle East, one can guess that it is about water. I tried to put a general presentation about water in the Middle East in the context of this particular report, and stressing also the issues of climate change, and more importantly, issues that are related to the area in particular. When we obviously, if I just try to look or analyze, starting from the title, rising temperatures leads to climate change, and the net effect is a net loss of water, if you wish, because of increased demand for water. That may, or the basic hypothesis is that to raise tension and lead to violent conflict, and that is particularly true perhaps for the Middle East. And reading the report tries to look at various aspects in terms of water, introduces various concepts in terms of cooperation and sharing, security and stability, building trust, and policy reform. If one looks at the overall Middle East, the report might be particularly true for the Tigris, Euphrates, Nile, the Orontes. Definitely, the prevailing water shortages experienced in many areas are expected to worsen with climate change. What will be the outcome of that? The outcome is expected to be potential for conflict to be exacerbated in regions where freshwater resources are shared, particularly in dry regions. And in this context, the Middle East is particularly prone, probably the most prone in the entire globe. Rami was mentioning that I was working on this since the ages of dinosaurs. That would put me as a very old person, but we've done quite a bit of work indeed, and I'm not sure if from back there you could see the type of work that we've been doing. And as recent as 2008, looking at virtual water trade as an adaptation, demand management of climate change impact on water resources in the Middle East. We looked at issues about conflict management alternatives in the Middle East. All of them are fully published in the open record. We looked at desalinations. We looked at the future water resources in the Middle East. We looked at the Nile River Basin. We looked at vulnerability and socioeconomic impacts in the Middle East and adaptation as well. We've been doing work on the Euphrates Basin. We looked at climate change and water resources in the Middle East as a vulnerability and adaptation assessment, part of the IPCC. We've also looked at the Israeli-Palestinian mountain aquifer in terms of case studies and water conflict resolutions. These are just a few to cite much work that we've been doing in water. And Based on these, we have various scenarios and various looks on climate change. We know for almost for sure that, and based on global circulation models as well, that temperatures would rise in this area, in this part of the world. And the rise of temperature is going to lead to an increase in water demand. Although water in general may not get affected as much as temperature, but the demand will increase. And increasing the demand is as if you are losing water. To talk in general about the climate change or not, whether we have it or not, what we know is that we experience large temporal and spatial variations in precipitations in the Middle East. That varies from as low as 18 millimeter in Egypt to as high as 800 and 850 millimeter in Lebanon. That pushed some people to say, well, Lebanon has more water. Let it share its water as part of conflict management per se. I am here to tell you that Lebanon does not have more water. Lebanon, if it uses all its water, it's barely enough. Sharing the water of Lebanon is not on the table really, because it is not adequate to start with. There is limited surface and groundwater resources, and there is, of course, in the Middle East, shared water resources. There are the shared rivers. They vary from basins of the basin of Jordan, the Jordan River, the Nile, the Euphrates Tigris, the Orontes, and the Al-Kabir between Syria and Lebanon. The aquifers, we have various transboundary aquifers, renewable and non-renewable, between Saudi Arabia and Jordan, between Lebanon and Israel, between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. You have various types of shared water resources. In this situation, we are in the context of conflict management, the shared watersheds, as I mentioned before, I try to summarize them in this table whereby I mentioned the freshwater body, the riparians, the controlling state. And if you look at the controlling state, is it always the downstream? Is it always the upstream? One would say, for instance, for the Jordan one, Israel is the main controller, which is located downstream. For the Nile, Egypt is the main controller, which is located downstream. For the Tigris-Euphrates, Turkey is the main controller, and it's located upstream. Is there any commonality between those? The main commonality that one discerns, and I raise this for discussion and challenge of this audience, is that those countries happens to be the strongest. So is it true that might is right? Is it true that this is going to push the other countries to be as strong as Egypt, as strong as Israel, or as strong as Turkey, in order to be able to get their fair share? These are questions that perhaps we can discuss during the next hour. Now, obviously, we would like to go towards cooperation and joint action. Generally, in terms of countries that are sharing international rivers, they face two-dimensional problem. One of them is the holistic management of water resources, and the second is water resources sharing. And in terms of management measures, those becomes at both levels, the national level, particularly in terms of institutional and policy reforms, and in terms of regional level. And that needs creation, as the report rightfully points out, of an atmosphere of trust. If I talk about overall, 9 out of 14 Middle Eastern countries have a freshwater potential of less than 1,000 meters cubed per person per year. That is a long time ago. By 2030, what's the expectations that will drop to less than 400 meters cubed per year? And if you see this table in here, one could readily notice the drop and the deficit in terms of balance of water budget in this region with time. And the drop of the availability on a per water person or per capita person to the 0.4 down below, which is the 400 meters cubed per year. Those are average overall. Of course, depending on the location of each country may get a little bit more, a little bit less. The constraints are fairly well known. In terms of limited information and inadequate data management, obsolete institutional arrangements, and limited public-private partnerships, limited economic valuation and inefficient cost recovery. And of course, last but not least, which is to some extent the topic of what we're dealing with today, is riparian and intersectoral conflicts. Now, when we look at pressures and impacts, absolutely climate change is one of them. However, it's really one of a matrix. If I look at population growth and industrial growth alone, climate change or not, they will likely surpass climate change impacts. If I look at increased urbanization, changes in the lifestyle, if I look at actions that we are undertaking in terms of overexploitation of groundwater, in terms of polluting water, in terms of soil deterioration in irrigated areas, in terms of high costs of developing new water supplies, wasteful use of existing water supplies, and so on, they all lead to increased pressure on scarce water resources. And the net result is, one of them is social-political conflicts. So if I put climate change and conflict, I can certainly put it in the context of an overall matrix. Some of the other parameters are quite often have more impact than climate change itself. This is not to belittle the importance of climate change. Climate change is there, and it is one of the most important topics in the mind of many policymakers since 10, 20 years. And we need to do something about it. The question is that, what is that needs to be done? The main issue is focused ultimately on water policy. In the Middle East or in many developing countries, the focus has always been on supply management. Increase the water, give them more water. We really have to have an equal aspect in terms of supply and demand management. In this context, if I look at an overall water policy, the main aspect of it, particularly in our countries, is the institutional reform and capacity building. They're coupled with demand management and supply management, adding to it the pollution prevention and environmental protection. The fourth component or the final component could be settlement of shared water disputes as well. All of these elements, they play an important role, combined with climate change and conflicts. At the end, what I would like to close with is that climate change or not, we know the problems and we know the solutions. They're fairly well defined. And we know the means in terms of the water policy and reform. If we are to implement it, with or without climate change, we have a win-win scenario. With this, I'll leave the floor to my colleague.
This year, 2009, is the year that will define our future. This year is the year of climate change. This year will test us for the first time collectively as a species.
Could you speak into the mic more directly so that they can hear? Put it closer.
And will determine if we humans will be up to the challenge and save all species on Earth, including ourselves, or make our home Earth uninhabitable for all life forms. Climate change is a global problem and can be only solved through a global agreement. Kyoto Protocol will end in 2012 and will become history. At the end of 2007, governments part of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change have started a new 2-year process to draft a new agreement to combat climate change. This agreement is supposed to come out in December 2009 in Copenhagen. The fight against climate change will redefine humanity. We are currently changing the conditions needed for our survival on the planet by our uncontrolled addiction to CO2-emitting coal and oil that are warming our planet. All existing scientific studies and research, including this report, only measure the impacts of climate change to the mid or end of this century. The impact on security, water resources, food production, etc. is only the start. The impacts that we are seeing already in Lebanon, such as increased forest fires, changes in seasons, less snow density, new insects attacking our cedars and forests, and change in the rainfall patterns, do not even represent 1% of the climate change impacts we will experience in the future. The science is very clear. We know the threat. It is the fight for survival. We know what needs to be done, and experts say we can do it. We need to shift our coal and oil economy to renewable energy technologies like solar and wind. What is only missing is political will. And to achieve this will, it requires that each one of us recognizes the threat to climate change and requests action. This political will needs to materialize in the Copenhagen Agreement in December. Let me explain more how important the Copenhagen Agreement is. In order to avoid catastrophic impact of climate change, we need to stabilize CO2 emissions by 2015 maximum. 6 years to achieve this is a very short time. Therefore, the Copenhagen Agreement is considered our last chance to save this planet. That is why most countries and major organizations around the world are focusing on climate change this year. Every region in the world is developing positions, discussing options, and engaging in negotiation processes to ensure the survival of its people, every region in the world besides the Arab world. As you all realize, most of our region do not even know that the most important treaty in the history of the United Nations is currently being discussed. In the current parliamentary elections in Lebanon, not even one delegate put climate change as a priority. We even doubt that one of them realizes that currently there is such a negotiation happening in Bonn. For example, yesterday a new round of negotiations started in Bonn, Germany, and will continue till June 12. 8 negotiators from IndyACT are there to lobby Arab countries to take strong positions. The feedback is very disappointing. Most Arab countries are not even concerned about the results of the negotiations, as if you are living on another planet. This is not acceptable, of course, and the new future government must put climate change as one of its priorities. In 2009, IndyACT is focusing all its campaigns on the number 350. This number is the most important number on Earth today, and everybody should remember it. This is the number that our leaders need to take with them to the climate negotiations next December. 350 is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere that scientists say we need to reach in order to stabilize our climate. At the moment, we are at 389 ppm, and we need to go back to 350. IndyACT is working to make sure every man, woman, and child in the Arab world will remember this number, and that our leaders will adopt it as their goal. If 350 ppm is not adopted as a global goal within the agreement in December, it will be too late to save the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a sobering presentation. Thank you also for your welcome and for Professor Corey and Ambassador Christensen. Thank you for opening the session today. And also I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank the Issam Fares Institute and IndyACT for helping us to organise this launch today. It's a great pleasure to be back, and I'm delighted to be here. By way of introduction, I'm Ollie Brown, by the way, from IISD. I just wanted to say a couple of words about my organisation. If my computer works. Okay, that's good. My computer is deciding to slow down on me. Okay, perfect. So, IISD is an independent organisation. It's headquartered in Canada, but it has offices in New York and Geneva, Switzerland, which is where I'm based. It was established by the Canadian government in 1990, and is mostly funded by government agencies to do research into issues of environment and development. We're not a political organisation, and we're not a campaigning organisation. We don't have any links to any country in the region here. I think that's important to say. We're come to this very much as a neutral observer. And we've been working on issues of climate change for the past 15 years and issues of security for the past 10 or so years. And we've been working with the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, looking at the relationship between climate change and foreign policy for the past few years now. And they asked us to look at what climate change might mean for peace and security in the Levant, by which we mean Israel, the occupied Palestinian territory, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. And both looking at the challenges, but also looking at whether it presented any opportunities for better cooperation between countries. We had a couple of extended trips to the region, and I or colleagues visited all the countries in the region. We interviewed experts, we held consultations in each country, and gathered all the available evidence and literature that we could find. I think we're in a unique position as sort of independent observers. We could speak to politicians, we could speak to ministers, to ambassadors, to security experts, to academics, to civil society groups, and so on. And this report is the product of that work. The draft was quite widely peer-reviewed in the region, and also we were given a huge amount of freedom by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to say potentially difficult things. So I should re-emphasize here that the positions we put forward in the report, the conclusions we come to in the report, don't reflect official Danish policy. Now, we're not out to prove that climate change is a security issue or that it's not a security issue. Rather, we wanted to look at the ways in which it might present a challenge. And we realise we're dealing with some very sensitive issues: water, conflict, security. And I doubt that everybody will agree with everything we say. So I think my aim is that if everybody disagrees with the report just a little, then we've probably come to a good balance. So I just wanted to talk very briefly about what we mean by climate change and how it might affect the region. Now, as we all know, our atmosphere regulates the temperature of the planet, protecting us from the strongest of the sun's rays and keeping a certain amount of heat in. And the problem is that human activity, particularly the burning of fossil fuels, is changing the composition of our atmosphere, increasing the amount of heat it traps. And as you can see, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been rising for the past couple of centuries, and we've already passed, as you were saying, we're up at 389 parts per million. You can see the atmospheric concentration was relatively stable and then goes up very fast, and the different coloured lines are predictions of where the concentrations will be by the end of this century, depending on what we do, partly in Copenhagen, depending on economic growth and how many greenhouse gases we emit. Now, as you can see, there's a direct correlation between the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the temperature. Over the last century, the Earth warmed by 0.6 of a degree, and this century it's predicted that global temperatures will rise on average by between 1.4 and 5.8 degrees. Now, what does this mean for the Levant? So, if emissions rise at their current rates, it'll get hotter. By 2050, between 2.5 and 3.7 degrees warmer in summer, and 2 to 3.1 degrees warmer in winter. They'll get drier. Rainfall will be less predictable. It may fall in shorter, harder bursts. It'll evaporate more quickly. It's likely that groundwater aquifers will recharge more slowly, and there'll be less water in the rivers. Some estimates expect that the flow of the Euphrates could fall by 30% by the end of the century, and the flow of the Jordan, what there is left of it, could fall by 80% by the end of the century. At the same time, the sea level will rise between 10 and 30 centimetres by the middle of this century, so within the lifetime of plenty of people in this room. This together will mean that the entire region is likely to get more arid. There'll be increasingly scarce water resources. It's likely that the quality of water in coastal areas will get worse. There'll be increasing demand for irrigation, and there'll be drops in agricultural productivity. But I think there are 4 additional factors that make this a particular problem, and you touched on them already in your presentation. Actually, sorry, if we look at this in terms of the over time, we can see how temperatures rise, and they rise particularly fast and particularly high in this part of the Eastern Mediterranean. So you can see the colour here is a rise in temperatures since 1990. If we look at 2040, it gets hotter. And in the 2070s, you can see it's heating up more here than other parts of the world. At the same time, the reduction in rainfall seems to be, or is predicted to be, particularly particularly acute here. And again, this is a reduction in rainfall from the averages in up to 1990. And you can see the red colour is the steepest reduction in rainfall. This is by the 2040s and by the 2070s. So I think there are 4 additional issues that make this problem particularly acute. One is that the region this is happening in the context of existing high water use. The region already uses a great proportion of its available renewable water resources. There's not a whole lot of spare water out there. And second, a lot of the region, the Levant, is not only poor in water, it's poor in energy, which limits the options to get around the water problem. If you're an energy-rich country like some of the Gulf states, then you can build desalination plants, albeit with a greenhouse gas implication, and make water. But if you're not, then building desalination plants just exchanges a water problem for an energy problem. Third, a lot of the water in the region is shared across boundaries. More than 80% of the renewable water resources that Syria uses comes from outside of its borders, for example. And in the Litani, I think I'm right in saying that Lebanon has the only major river in the entire region that is not transboundary. And on this slide you can see examples of the aquifers which are shared between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. So a lot of water is shared, which means you have to negotiate access to water, and if you don't trust your neighbours, then that negotiation becomes a tricky issue. The fourth issue is population growth, which is amongst the fastest in the world. This first slide shows the population in 2008, but this is what the population will look like in 2050. The combined population of the Levant is set to rise to 71 million from 42 million now. But there won't be any more available water, any more than there is now, water or fertile agricultural land. So you'll have more people in competition for the same or less available water. And already we can see that the population, there's a very young population in the region, which means that as these people grow older, this is the percentage of the population under 15 in 2005, these people will want jobs, houses, food and water. And with population growth and economic growth, there will be increased demand for water, food and land. So this is the situation facing the region. In our report we make 3 major points. The first is that the history of conflict makes climate change a more serious issue in the Levant than elsewhere, and than it would be otherwise. The second is that climate change presents, we think, some very real threats to peace and security in the region. And the third is to argue that we shouldn't despair, as there's much we can do to tackle this problem. And I'd like to explain each of these points in turn. The countries of the Levant have experienced more than 60 years of conflict: civil war, invasion, occupation, suicide attacks, rocket attacks. And the legacy of conflict in the region has both physical impacts but less tangible impacts as well. Tens of thousands of lives have been lost. Infrastructure has been damaged. Roads, wells and power grids have been destroyed. Businesses, schools and hospitals have been closed down. It's cut off access to land. Farmers can't get to their fields. Products can't reach markets. It's also cut off access to water and reduced the opportunity for people to work in other countries. It's impossible, for example, for somebody from Lebanon to work in Israel, or somebody from Israel to work in Lebanon.
Well, they can try. They are. Very well.
And the other thing I would suggest is that the history of conflict has led countries to spend a lot of money on arms and their armies, which could have been spent elsewhere, on clinics, on schools, and so on. So if we look at, this is the percentage of GDP spent on health in the region, on education in the region, and on the military in the region. In every single country it outpaces health and education spending. But I think those are the physical impacts, but I think there are less tangible impacts that purely in terms of the ability of countries to adapt to climate change make it much more difficult. I think they're harder to see, but they're just as profound. I think it's led to a deep distrust between countries, an unwillingness to work together to find solutions to regional problems of water and energy. I think it's led to an island mentality and a zero-sum approach to negotiating resources, where every country sees that it has to look after itself, and then the mutual benefits of resources, of sharing resources, are rarely considered. It's led to a lack of transparency with data. I think there's a real problem with data and understanding what is actually happening. Data tends to be very sensitive, and it's very rarely shared between countries, but also within countries. And I think this means that perceptions and rumours rather than facts often guide policies and politics. It led to a preference for national level politics, national level projects like the Red Dead Canal, like the IndyACT project, which can be quite expensive ways of providing water. But it seems to be that countries prefer to manufacture water themselves than negotiate or share it across boundaries. I think it's also possible to see how it undermines the efficient management of water, because there's often a fear that water saved in one country will be wasted by another. And I think it's clear to us that the lack of statehood for the Palestinian Authority undermines its participation in international processes like the debate on climate change, and undermines its access to funding to adapt to climate change. Now, I'm not making a political point here at all, I'm just merely stating a fact that it makes it more difficult for the Palestinians to deal with climate change. Altogether, we would argue that this means that the history of conflict in the region amplifies the challenges of climate change. It makes it a worse challenge than it otherwise would be. It makes it a worse problem than it otherwise would be. Now, whether or not a sustainable peace is possible depends on a great many factors. World events, individual political decisions, technological advances, economic growth, and so on. And I would argue that climate change also shapes and will shape the prospects of the region. And I'm not arguing here that it's by any means the most important single factor. But in the current political landscape, we see a few distinct threats coming as a result of climate change. The first is that climate change may increase competition for scarce resources, complicating existing and future peace agreements. The division of water has been an essential element of nearly every piece of negotiation in the region. For example, talks between Syria and Israel broke down in the year 2000 over the issue of access to the waters of the Galilee. If the available water resources are reduced, it may make some existing agreements untenable, such as the Jordan-Israel peace agreement, which has an side agreement on water linked to it. But I think it also may make the negotiation of future agreements more difficult. There's less space, there's less flexibility to negotiate creative solutions. The second threat that we see is that if climate change reduces agricultural productivity locally and raises the price of food globally, it would have the effect of intensifying food insecurity. Already the region has had a taste of this with the 2007-2008 drought. The wheat harvest in Syria last year was less than half of what it was in previous years. Now, as we all know, food security is a very politically sensitive issue. Providing food is a question of control over land on which to grow crops, and control over water with which to grow crops. If there's a decrease in the availability of food, it could raise the stakes for the return or the retention of occupied land, changing, for example, the basis of the calculation that Israel would make over whether to return the Golan Heights to Syria or to withdraw from the West Bank. Now, I'm not suggesting by any means that it's necessarily the most important issue in that calculation, but we can see how it could be an issue. Thirdly, the combined impact of climate change could slow economic growth. Globally, a very well-known report commissioned by the UK government by a guy called Nicholas Stern, the Stern Review, predicted that the global impact on GDP of climate change, if unchecked, could be between 5 and 20% of GDP. In this region, we see several dimensions to this. I mean, there's obviously reducing the productivity of the agricultural sector, but also closing off previously viable activities. Again, in Syria last year, the government made a decision no longer to produce cotton for export. Now, Syria used to produce 4 million tons of cotton, but it's a very water-intensive crop. It's a thirsty crop, and they've decided from now on that they'll produce only for the domestic market, so 1 million tons. So that's their export market in cotton is over. So that could have economic impacts if that's replicated in other sectors. It could also inhibit growth in the tourism industry. I mean, together it can make it increasingly hard to create jobs, and in turn could lead to greater poverty and social instability. Of course, the combined effects of fewer jobs in rural areas and spreading desertification may lead to large-scale movements of people from rural to urban areas, putting increasing strain on those urban areas. I mean, the population in Oman is already 2.5 million, and is predicted to rise to 6.4 million by the middle of the century. So increases in rural-urban migration put immense strain on urban services. And again, in Syria, in the northeastern part of Syria, the drought led to the wholesale abandonment of 160 villages, and those people moved to urban areas. So there's an implication there for both urban services, but also, I think, for the relationship between migrant populations and urban populations, and also between existing refugee populations, an issue that, as we know, is already highly sensitive. The fifth area that we see is as a threat is that as water resources and viable agricultural land shrink or are perceived to shrink, we see that these resources could become even more politicized and potentially militarized. I think the expectation that water resources are shrinking changes the dynamics of negotiation. I think it can be used by opportunistic politicians as a political vehicle, or by armed groups as a pretext to justify their continued existence. The sixth threat is, I think, quite different. Is that if these problems start to develop in the region and we start to see them more clearly, I think we risk increasing resentment and distrust of the countries that are basically the main cause of this problem in the beginning. So the West, and I would include Israel in that, in terms of the major greenhouse gas emitters, if there is no deal on reducing greenhouse gases. I think it sort of reinforces the sense in much of the Arab world that the countries of the West are not acting as good global citizens. Now, if we look at the per capita greenhouse gas emissions, the emissions are smallest in the occupied Palestinian territories, then in Syria, then Jordan, then Lebanon, and you see that per capita emissions of greenhouse gases in Israel are a lot higher than the world, but also a little bit higher than the European average as well. So there's an implication there for the relationships between the countries that have historically produced the most greenhouse gases and the rest of the world, if the impacts of climate change start to really be felt quite strongly. The US is up off the graph. The US is about 22 metric tons. So yeah, it's way off the top of the screen. So I think the challenges of both of climate change and security in the Middle East are daunting. But I think it's really important to be clear about what I'm not saying here. I'm not arguing that climate change will automatically lead to conflict in the Levant. Nor am I suggesting that all of those six threats are automatically going to happen, are definitely going to happen. What I am suggesting is that climate change is going to make managing water resources, managing food resources, promoting economic growth, providing jobs more difficult. And I think in turn making the above scenarios more likely. And if we're aware of the possible interactions between climate change and security, well then we're in a much better position to do something about them. And in fact I think there's a great deal that can be done. I'd like to close off by suggesting 4 broad strategies for action. In the report we have many detailed recommendations, but I've picked out just a few to illustrate some of the things that I think can be done. The first is, as we've called it, to foster a culture of conservation. As the chief scientist of the Israeli Ministry of Environment puts it, everyone needs to do more with less. This includes encouraging more water and energy efficient measures. It includes investing in water infrastructure and small-scale rainwater harvesting and solar panels. It includes building awareness of the need to conserve scarce water and energy resources. And I think raising awareness on climate change can help to do this. The second is, whatever happens in Copenhagen, the countries in the region are going to need to adapt to climate change. because the climate is going to continue to carry on changing for some time, even if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow. This could involve integrating climate change into national development strategies and sharing strategies for the sorts of adaptation that work best. And one of the things that we recommend is that we should think about creating a regional centre for adaptation to climate change that could share these ideas across the region. And I think we also need to find mechanisms to fund adaptation projects in the occupied Palestinian territory. The third area, I guess, is an obvious one. It's that we need to avoid dangerous climate change in the first place. And this means radically reducing the amount of greenhouse gases we produce. Now, obviously, this is primarily the responsibility of the rich countries who produce the most greenhouse gases historically. On a per capita basis, most of the countries in the Levant, with the exception of Israel, produce relatively few greenhouse gases. But if the Arab world nations were to take on commitments to reduce their greenhouse gases, I think it would be a powerful demonstration of global solidarity. And also, moving towards clean energy systems and renewable energy sources would also help to solve the power crisis here in Lebanon and also combat local air pollution. I think the final strategy is greater regional cooperation. Now, clearly the challenge of climate change is one that's beyond the capacity of any one country to deal with. And I'm not suggesting here that somehow the threat of climate change is going to somehow transcend decades of Arab-Israeli conflict. However, there are existing mechanisms through which better collaboration could be pursued, such as the Arab League or the Euro-Med Partnership. And I think in particular there's a real need for non-partisan forums for the sharing of information, regional approaches to resource management, and the encouragement of the cooperative management of resources in the region. With that, I would like to stop there. Perhaps welcome Professor Curry back to the panel and open up for questions and comments. And I very much look forward to your feedback and the discussion.
Thank you very much to the speakers. I just want to make a couple of quick points, if I could. I think the relationship between security and water is kind of or security and natural resources. I think one of the few points that I think I disagree with in the report is what I think is a slightly exaggerated emphasis on the danger of resources becoming militarized. I think the reality of the modern Arab world is probably it may be the opposite. And we saw with the Jordan-Israel peace agreement when I was in Jordan when that was being negotiated, that they negotiated, part of it is that the Israelis give the Jordanians extra water, desalinated or fresh water. With the Egyptians, with the Israelis getting out of Sinai back in the early 70s, or early 80s, after the first Camp David agreement, the Israelis always said they'd never leave Sinai because of the oil. In fact, they got out and the Egyptians sold them the oil. So commercial arrangements can usually overcome, commercial agreements are better than political occupation. I think that's the lesson. So if there is a will to make a peace agreement, the resources issues become very solvable. And I think the real issue is, which Mutasem mentioned is in the report as well, is better management, better water management policies. I mean, the way that the Arab countries allocate water for bananas and cotton and is ridiculous, is completely incoherent. But it's done because we have public policies that are very erratic, to be polite, very inconsistent and often not very good. So I think better management, better policies is one way to deal with this. The other thing is the issue of I think a security approach to these issues is important, but more important is a rights-based approach, that people have rights, individuals have rights, human beings have rights on the basis of their status as human beings and citizens of countries. And all human beings have equal rights, Israelis, Arabs, Iranians, Turks. So I think a rights-based approach, parallel with a security approach, parallel with the natural resources, etc., is one of the ways to look at this. And it raises the point again, which we're trying to look at through our Research and Policy Forum on Climate Change. You can only study these issues in an integrated way. You can no longer look at water efficiency, or allocation of water, or pricing of water, or technological or desalination or whatever. You need to look at this in a completely integrated way with sociologists, urban planners, agriculturalists, economists, etc., etc. And this is one of the approaches that we're trying to develop through our Climate Change and Environment Forum at AUB, by taking this very integrated look with our colleagues around the region and the world to study these issues. And the last point is that this should be done by governments, but it's not. Arab governments, by and large, are not addressing the challenge of climate change. There's a lack of seriousness and a lack of analytical capability and policy setting that is frightening for those of us who are Arabs. And this is one of the things we're trying to do, is to push from within the Arab world to get a more serious approach. And the dilemma, of course, is that there's a massive contradiction in the Arab world between reducing carbon emissions and reducing oil and gas sales. I mean, the Arab world, the easiest thing to do is say, okay, let's switch to nuclear energy and then get rid of oil and gas. But the Arab world will come to a halt. So what do you do when Arab sales of oil and gas are so critical, not just for the oil producers, but for countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, who depend on remittances and aid and investments and trade? So there's a massive contradiction within the Arab world, which in typically incoherent Arab public policy fashion is unaddressed. People are not seriously looking at this issue within the Arab world, and it's one of the, again, we're with people like IndyACT and us and others, we're working together with UN agencies, foreign governments, trying to raise these issues and push and prod the public policy-making institutions, governments and others to really come to grips with these tough realities. But it's striking how in the end, you always get back, in any of these discussions, you always get back to 2 points. You need to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, and you need to address the needs of young people in the Arab world. Youth and Arab-Israeli peacemaking are the critical imperatives that override every single other aspect of life in this region. And then we need to address those two issues squarely and diligently. So I will stop with those comments and open the discussion if anybody...
Morocco, Egypt, and so on. How do you see this development? Is it serious? Yeah? Because I don't personally regard it as a solution, of course. It would make things much more complicated in the area, politically, ecologically, and so on. But how do you see that? What do you know about this development? Thank you.
It's very nice to see you here. I've read a lot of your papers, so it's thanks for coming. Sure. In terms of, I'm not an expert on the nuclear politics in the region, but one of the things that we saw quite strongly in Jordan, and it comes back to the point that we make about the need and because it's what we call the island mentality of resources, that every country wants to develop its own sources of water, its own sources of food, and so on, is that you lead to quite expensive sort of national level projects, and the one that's being talked about at the moment is the Red Dead Canal, and the idea of powering, the way to power the water out of the Red Sea into the Dead Sea is through nuclear power plants, which are being discussed at the moment, right, to be built down near Aqaba, near the Saudi Arabian border. So that's obviously ongoing discussions for that. When we were in Jordan, it seemed that there was quite a lot of momentum towards that point of view, and we also met actually the Israeli ambassador to Jordan, and we asked him that same question: what is the Israeli approach to Jordan having a nuclear reactor as well? And his point was, well, we don't like the fact that it's on an earthquake zone, but we don't have any inherent problem with it per se, as long as it's built safely. So I to be honest, a long answer to a short question is that I'm not really sure, but it seems that there is a certain amount of momentum moving towards dealing with the energy crisis through nuclear, because that's a way of finding domestic sources of energy. And as we all know, energy is very intimately linked to water. And if you want to create water, if you want to find water, you need energy. So given that the whole region is very energy poor, and Syria became a net energy importer last year, one of the ways of dealing with that energy problem is through nuclear. And so I think there will be increasing momentum towards nuclear power in the coming years.
I'm Issam Fares Institute. I have a question related to your analysis and your research in Israel, because I've read that you've met a lot of Israeli experts and officials. I want your personal reaction about our crisis in July 2006 war, especially the oil spill. Is the Israeli experts, not politicians, are really knowing what the Israeli government did to this country, especially that in the international organizations until now the Israelis are neglecting any responsibility about this crisis, and they are not willing to pay any penny, even that UNEP and other organizations asked them to pay at least 5 million, 1 billion. So this is the first question. And another question related to Fuad's question is about the coal strategy, because we've read that I think in Dubai or other, they are building a big industry, energy industry built on, based on coal. Also, this is another question. Coal, yeah.
The important thing with this report for us is that we came to this as a neutral organisation, and so I've been very keen not to, in the report, not to come up with any political points or any judgment one way or the other on the rights issue or the rights and wrongs of particular conflicts per se, because that's not my place to say anything about it, and there's people who have who know a great deal more about it than I do. And so we didn't discuss anything to do with the rights and wrongs of the 2006 conflict and whether or not Israel should be paying compensation. And I think it's probably not my place to make any statements on that.
Hello, it's Hugh McLeod from the Guardian newspaper. A question for Engineer El Fadel. You say, as we know, that Lebanon has the highest rainfall levels in the region, I think by quite a long way, 850 millimeters a year. And you said that's inadequate for the country's needs. Can you explain why that is and what can be done about it?
Sure. I mean, if you look at the water balance in Lebanon, and if you look at the need for Lebanon in terms of domestic, industrial, and agriculture, and you make the projections, you will find that the net water balance for Lebanon is still in a deficit, even after implementing good management practices. That is what is based on. We have studies on that. You can take a look at them and find out that it is impossible to subscribe to the notion that sometimes some scientists in Israel try to propagate, whereby that the Litani River could be shared with Israel. And at some stages they even hindered or hinted to that the Litani River basin is connected to the Hasbani basin, and therefore they have a right on the Litani. And the answer to that is fairly clear. I mean, they stayed 22 years in the south. If they had evidence of that, they would have shown it. The Litani is totally independent, and gathering all the water, even with the 10-year plan, with the dams that are planned through the Ministry of Water Resources, if they're all built, we will still be hardly meet the deficit of Lebanon.
But I mean, anyone who lives here, we see snow on the mountains. I mean, are existing water management practices adequate? And I mean, in Lebanon, are the existing water management practices adequate? No. And I mean, when you live here, you see the water running off the mountains into the sea. You know, this God knows how much. I mean, why is it not being harvested in Lebanon?
That's exactly what we're saying. Is that one is that there's a certain portion of the water and the snow. There is no way that it will run to the sea. This is for granted. That's nature. You cannot prevent nature. But even if we harvest all of the water that we can harvest, and we manage it the best we could, the long term, it will hardly be enough for us. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that today, for instance, when you say that there's mismanagement, of course there's mismanagement. How many days do you get the water in your apartment during the year? That's the result of mismanagement. If we manage better, then you don't have to experience water shortages, but this does not mean that we have water to export. I'll get Nadeem also, he raised his hand too.
Yeah. If I just may add to what Dr. Fadel was saying.
Nadeem, introduce yourself so
yes,
they know.
my name is Nadeem Farah. I'm a faculty member at the Agriculture and Food Sciences. I teach environmental hydrology courses. What we have is that we have too many people, basically. And the 850 millimeter, you're looking at it as a depth over a smaller area than anywhere else. If you look at it as per capita, then we have much lower water resources available to us than many other countries in the Middle East. So it is a perception that we have a lot of water. We do have mismanagement. Even if we harvest, as Mutasem was saying, all of our water that's coming off the mountains, we have about, in a small study that we had done, we have about 220 million cubic meters that we can store from this runoff that we get. And that's hardly enough for us to go into the 2050 and whatnot, and especially with anticipated shortages in rainfall. So all of that just doesn't bode well for us. It's just perceptions that we deal with.
Alistair?
Alistair Lyon from Reuters.
You have to switch it on.
Speak right into it, put it right in front of your mouth.
Alistair Lyon from Reuters. For a question for Ollie Brown. There was a sort of sharp intake of breath when you showed the chart on population increase. And I think it would have been even sharper if we'd seen a few other Arab countries like Yemen or the UAE. And yet when you were talking about measures to mitigate the impact of climate change and the pressures that you've been talking about on the overall matrix, you didn't mention anything about population control, and I was wondering if you could explain why.
Excellent question. Excellent question. I think it's actually quite important to say that in terms of the speed with which per capita allocations of water are declining, they're probably going to decline faster as a result of population growth and climate change. And this is, I think you're hitting on something very important here. This is the thing that's not talked about for a whole number of reasons, because people sort of work in silos, and I'm not a population person, so I don't sort of end up focusing on that. But you're absolutely right, and that's part of the whole managing of demand. And there's a lot of different ways in which demand is going to have an impact on the water resources. One is the overall number of people, but it's also about the impact of economic growth, and also this sense with which the effectiveness of infrastructure and how efficiently that's the water is used. For example, in Jordan, more than 50% of water is lost to bad infrastructure. So it's a huge amount is lost. Same in Lebanon. So this is that point about how just with more efficient use of water, you actually increase your overall use of availability of water. We should have perhaps put something in about population growth. It just tends to be a sensitive issue, and it's one that I'm not particularly comfortable with, and gets into a whole other area of social and health policy that is another issue entirely. But it fits into that broader issue of, we look at increasing demand in the region for water and food and jobs and land to build houses on, at the same time as there's a whole series of factors that are reducing the availability of that water and food, and we see climate change as one of those factors.
Actually, to come to Ali's rescue a little bit also, the issue is sensitive when people from outside the region come to the region and say you have to have fewer children. It's not so sensitive for the Middle East itself, because most governments in the region and most societies are already quickly declining their birth rates, except for the occupied Palestinian territories, the only place where fertility rates are not dropping as fast as other places because of the obvious situation they're in. But if you look at a place like Iran, Egypt, or other places, fertility rates have declined by more than half. And it's a direct correlation with education of women, and economic development. So the population growth rate more or less will take care of itself with a little bit of government intervention, and that's the lesson of the last 20 or 30 years. It's so clear across the region. But when people from abroad start suggesting this, it becomes, or the Israelis, it becomes obviously completely rejected. But it is an important issue, but it's an issue that's more or less self-regulating. If you have good government policies and the rights of people are respected, they get an education, they get an opportunity to develop economically, fertility rates and family sizes go way down.
Good morning.
That's on, just put it straight there.
My name is Lamia Mansour. I'm managing a program funded by the German government called the Environmental Fund for Development. This is very interesting for all of us. We have technical data, we have numerical data and projections, but this analysis of tensions and political instability is very important to feed into this academic and scientific information in order to complete the picture. But my question to you is, how can we really influence national policies, and how you as a group can make sure that the policymakers and at the practical level, those who are involved in adopting real measures can benefit from reports like this. We all seem to be here, academicians, researchers, or just people, environmental activists who are interested in the field, but decision makers, the politicians, the government is not here so far. Can you give us some light over how you plan to help in this?
I would mind to start answering this question. Denmark hosting the World Conference later this year, of course, is doing a lot of work lobbying vis-a-vis the individual governments. And I will, as ambassador to Lebanon, for Denmark, as soon as there's a new government here, I will also contact the new government and the relevant ministers and people there to help them understand the consequences of the climate change, and therefore also hopefully help them to be more active in the run-up to the conference in December. That's part of my duty and my lobby work here. So that's just part of it, but many other things can be done. And of course, IndyACT will have also busy time after the formation of government. I leave to you.
I'm not for this will help, but on October 24 this year, we're going to have a global deal of action against climate change. It's international. IndyACT is responsible for organizing actions in the Arab world and Lebanon. So for the time being, up till now, we have been able to have 200 people committed to do actions on this day, basically to shout out 350 in whatever way you want. I don't know if you were at the beginning of the session when I talked about 350 was, yeah. So we're having actions with students, university students, school students, NGOs, we're talking to politicians, we don't get answers, this is expected, but we're trying our best. And we're going to have so many actions on this day, all at the same time, in all the different countries, shouting out the same number, just 6 weeks before Copenhagen. So this is one way of trying to do something about it.
If I can add also, one of the programs that we've launched at the Issam Fares Institute at a regional level is precisely to study that issue, the link between research, advocacy, and public policy making. How does research influence policy making? Why does it not? In other words, who makes policy? Who makes decisions? Who in the Lebanese or Moroccan or Syrian governments will decide one day that this is a real priority, we've got to bring the best minds in the country, we've got to give this priority in the budget, we have to deal with this issue. How does that happen? Who takes the initiative? Who are the decision makers? Who has influence? Who has control? Who can block a policy? Where does research enter into the policy making process? Is it at the parliamentary committees, in the bureaucracy, at a dinner with the king or the president, maybe the security services, the tribal chiefs, the private sector? All of these are actors in our society. All of them influence policy making. Why suddenly does one Arab government decide it wants to reform the education system? Or somebody says they want to reform the agricultural sector. That process is not understood. Public policy making in the Arab world is largely unexplored, unexamined. A lot of people criticize it, as we do, and it deserves criticism generally based on the performance. But we need to engage with the public sector. We have to assume that they're innocent until proven otherwise, and deal with them and work with them. And to their credit, a few times when we've started already, we're in our early days, but when we've engaged public sector officials, ministers, government officials, parliamentarians around the region, they've actually been receptive. Partly because we've chosen people who we know are receptive and civic-minded. They want to solve these problems. So we're actually studying this in a systematic way with professors here and others around the region and NGOs. And this is one of our ongoing programs. So if anybody's interested in this issue, there's a mechanism where you can get involved with us on this thing too.
Maybe I could add, we're talking to the Lebanese government and we're talking to the business associations, the private sector here. I can use Denmark as an optimistic example because we should not have the idea that to avoid further greenhouse gas increases, we have to reduce our economic growth. It's actually possible to have economic growth and reduce the gas out emissions and have lesser consumption of energy. And Denmark can give excellent figures here. Let me just mention a few figures here. Over the last 25 years, Denmark has had a growth rate, economic growth rate of 70%. At the same level, at the same time, we have had zero growth of energy consumption, and we have had even a decrease in greenhouse gases. So it's a question of producing more efficiently and smarter. And of course, renewable energy is part of this. Some of you would know that Denmark is a leading country in producing windmills and leading country in exporting windmills. Denmark today is basing quite an important proportion of the electricity consumption on renewable energy. 20%, 1/5 of electricity consumption today is based on renewable energy. That's extremely important. Let me just give a little comparison here. Lebanon, the public sector is producing, EDL is producing some 1,600 megawatt. In total, we know that this is 700 megawatt, too little to actually satisfy the Lebanese market. The windmills in Denmark alone produce 3,200 megawatts. That's twice the total production of energy in Lebanon. There is here also, of course, a potential for Lebanon to go ahead with windmills and starting up having updated wind atlas. But being here as a newcomer to Lebanon, enjoying the 300 sunny days a year, I am puzzled about why does Lebanon not have more energy production based on solar energy? I just don't understand it. Just the final figure I'll give to you, and then I'll stop here. I will give you more interesting figures. There is a concept called energy intensity, which is the ratio between energy consumption and real GDP. Over the last 20 years, this ratio has gone down 13% in Denmark. So having an increase in production, at the same time you can have a decrease in consumption. And this is again a question of producing more efficiently and smarter. I could give you many more ideas. And of course, when I talk to the Lebanese government and when I talk to the private sector here, I'll give these figures and hope to inspire them to do the same.
Yes. Here.
Thank you, Tarek Sadat, to you and UNESCO. My question is to Dr. Mutasem El Fadel. You mentioned that sometimes the most downstream country in shared river basin is the strongest because of political influences. And you referred to Egypt and Israel in their respective shared basins. I think these criteria cannot be taken in isolation from other factors. Like when we look, for example, for the case of Egypt, if Egypt is the strongest country and it is the most downstream country, why the Nile Basin Initiative is not endorsed until today? So I think these criteria should be combined with other factors. The riparian countries, when they sit in the table, they are equal in skills, I feel, and I don't want to say the most upstream countries are the stronger, but they should be equal to reach a win-win situation, which you referred to in the last slide. Thank you.
Indeed, this is exactly the question that I was raising. Which one is controlling the basin? I was raising a question. I was not saying whether it is the right of the downstream or the upstream. I was raising it more as a question, and I looked at the commonality between who's controlling overall or getting the most or the lion's share of the basin. It happens to be the stronger component today. That's all what I said. And was you told me that all riparians have the right and equal rights entering water in accordance with international law.
Abdurrahman Saghir, ex-AUB professor of agriculture. I would like to ask about the future of biofuel versus the use of crude oil as far as climate change is concerned. Thank you.
I can comment and leave for my colleagues elsewhere as well. I mean, the main thing about biofuel now and the debate that's raging around it is that, particularly for countries like the Middle East, is that it needs a lot of water in order to raise the source of the biofuel. You need water. That's the main limitation for us. It is still even now debated in, let's say, places like the US and Europe in terms of that water which is being diverted to biofuel. Could it be raising the price of food? Because it is diverted from irrigating food to producing energy and biofuel. So those are my two comments on that.
Thank you. I mean, just very quickly, IISD does quite a lot of work on biofuels and the relative environmental and development impacts of that, particularly the use of government money, public money, to subsidise the production of biofuels. And our basic point is that, particularly with first-generation biofuels, which basically take are not cellulosic ethanol and take the place of food crops, they are environmentally problematic. They lead to often net increases in carbon dioxide emissions if you clear forests to grow palm oil, as is happening across Indonesia. And they can be a very expensive use of avoiding carbon. So if the price of a ton of carbon at the moment on the open market is something like $20, something like that, the price of a ton of avoided carbon through biofuels, through the states, through the subsidization of biofuels in Iowa, for example, is something more like $250 per ton. So it's a bad use of public money. It has environmental impacts. It has water impacts as well. And one of and as we've seen last year, particularly, it has a very real impact on the price of food. And this is one of the points that I make in the report, is that the region here, I think, is very susceptible to the international price of food. The region doesn't produce enough food for itself. And actually, ironically, part of the reason why there's been less of a food problem here over the last 50 years is because of consistent subsidization of agriculture in the US and EU, which has lowered world prices of food, which has allowed basically the region to afford the food that it has. Even so, a lot of countries are in a net food deficit. Jordan, for example, a few years ago was paying $115 more per person per year for food because of food imports. And so if biofuels have an additional impact on the global price of food, in addition to the predictions that increased drought, increased storms and so on will lead to greater volatility of global food prices, then I think that has a real impact in terms of food prices here, in terms of food security, and then, as we've seen, in terms of sort of social stability. It was a problem across the region in Jordan in the 90s in terms of the rising price of food led to riots and so on. If we saw that systemically increasing, across the region, I think that would be a very real issue for domestic stability in each country.
Over there. Go ahead.
My name is Megan. I'm with a new science magazine called The Observer. And my question to you, on the ground, you talked about a regional approach to climate change, and I was wondering if you could explain how you see that kind of coming about, whether through existing organizations or creating new ones.
One of the points that we make is that I think it's naive I think a lot of European nations would love to see that climate change encourages better cooperation between Israel and its neighbouring countries, and we think that's a bit naive in the circumstances. There's obviously decades of conflict there, and there was a conflict. We were doing the research in January, and there are very hardened attitudes towards the Israeli position in the region. So we don't necessarily frame it in terms of wider cooperation in terms of Israel and the Arab states, but there's lots of cooperation that can be done both bilaterally between countries, so between Syria and Lebanon, for example, but also in terms of regionally linking up grids of water grids or energy grids. And I know this is an issue that has been very prominent in Lebanon in terms of the link to the gas pipeline that goes through Syria to Turkey. And so there's regional cooperation that can be done over the sharing of resources. But then one of the other things we were talking about is regional cooperation over the provision of data. And I think this is one of the things that's really important. I mean, Lebanon, in Lebanon in particular, I think data is very sensitive. I think I'm correct in saying Lebanon hasn't had an official census since 1932. And that's an example of how important data is. Now, if you don't have non-partisan forms of data, then you don't know what your starting point is. You don't know how things are changing. You don't know how fast things are changing. So I think it's very important to set up those kind of systems. And I think it's also important to share the best available lessons from adaptation to climate change across the region. Now, that people I say that and people think, well, that involves selling Israeli drip irrigation technology elsewhere. And we're not necessarily talking about that. But there's a lot of mechanisms that could be set up to share that kind of technology. And one of the things we call for in this report is the creation of a regional centre for adaptation that can help to build that. So basically, I think there's a lot of different levels for that kind of cooperation. Some of it through new institutions, such as a regional centre for adaptation, and some of it through existing institutions, such as the Arab League or the Euromed Partnership or the European Neighbourhoods neighbourship policy and so on. So I think we just need to look at it pragmatically and think about what we're trying to achieve and then look at what the options are.
Kareem?
Kareem Matheson from the Political Studies Department here at AUB. I'd like to go back and ask a question that Rami in fact had raised earlier about a rights-based approach. And ask you, when Rami asked about it, you said that you thought that was a political matter and you didn't want to get into it. But in fact, the report actually has, just glancing over it, has a bunch of political things in it, which are controversial. So you do get into things. For instance, you say that there's serious tension between all Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and the Lebanese, which is disputable. It's not all Palestinian refugees. You talk about the separation wall the separation barrier instead of a wall. So you do take positions within this paper which are political in nature. And so I'm surprised that there is no discussion of a rights-based approach, which obviously is pertinent to the Palestinians who are under occupation and who receive far less water than settlers, let alone the Israelis themselves. And of course, so it's not just a question of the Palestinian-Israeli issue, but the rights-based approach would also be important for most Arab citizens and people whose main issue is as the Arab panelists here have emphasized, is the relationship between people and the state structure. It's a state structure that's most repressive and oppressive, and not just in terms of water and security and other things, but in emphasizing the security. You're saying there's a potential militarization of it. This will increase the possibility of the state structures taking firmer control and pushing away rights of people more and more. And I think these kinds of reports might actually serve to, by emphasizing, for instance, problems between refugees and people, and by saying this is going to be more of a problem, you're actually giving state structures and state apparatus even more of an opportunity to take away rights of people and citizens. And I'm surprised that there's less of a discussion of rights and there's no mention of justice at all for people, particularly for the Palestinians, but for normal citizens throughout this region anyway.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, I think the implication that we have throughout the report is, I guess, one a rights-based approach, but we're quite careful about not making. You're absolutely right. It's impossible to talk about water. It's impossible to talk about land without it being political. The choice of language is very political. If you call it a wall, a separation barrier, a security fence, obviously if it's a security barrier, then it's seen as pro-Israeli. If it's the apartheid wall or that kind of thing, it's seen as has a different approach. What we've tried to do is we've tried to take the most neutral language we could find, and the language that is most reflected in international documents and the UN system, because it's not. If we're going to have the impact that we want to have with this report, I think we need to be seen as being very neutral and not trying to come up with any one particular a favourable view of one side or the other, which is why we were quite careful about steering clear of things that could be perceived in that way. We still make some quite, I think, sensitive points, and one of the basic conclusions of the report is that the history of conflict in a whole number of different ways undermines people's ability to deal with climate change. And that's making a factual point, but within it there's a whole series of implications as well.
I wanted to add something along these lines also, and say that if in this region you want to play, if people in this region want to play any constructive role in trying to solve the climate change issue, if they want to influence in any way the governments of the region, well, I think it's almost impossible under the current situation, because we don't have the rule of law, we don't have democracies. Maybe we have a quarter democracy here, 5% democracy there, and that answers your question, Dan. I mean, we have IndyACT and Greenpeace in Lebanon and a couple of other NGOs, and some other countries also, some people doing some good work. In some countries you have nothing. In many Gulf countries you have nothing. And it's the issue of no human rights, no rule of law, no independent judiciary, and de facto no democracy. And I think that's interlinked. And my suggestion would be just maybe if you ever revise this report and so on, just to include the issue of these issues, inside, because the ability to provoke any change in this region under the current political circumstances is almost nil. And that's very depressing.
If I can just make a quick point on the basis of that, and also I think your point, Karim. One of the things that came out to us very strongly from our consultation that we held in January in Beirut was that there's a danger of talking about climate change as a security issue. And this is the fact that in the context of the sort of system that you talk about, in the context of a problem with the transparency of data, that if you start talking about climate change as a security issue, it takes it away from the public domain. It becomes something that goes behind closed doors. And in a sense, this is very different to how it's discussed in Europe. If you discuss in Europe, I think, climate change as a security issue, you change it from being an environmental issue that's about polar bears and butterflies, and you change it from being an energy issue that's about, the way we produce biofuels, for example, and it becomes an issue of high politics, an issue of sort of central government politics. And that's the way that you get prime ministers to talk about climate change. If you talk about it in terms of polar bears, you get environment ministers talking about it and nothing happens. So I think there's certainly that risk, and I think what you were talking about was, in a sense, the danger that if you talk about it in that way, then you talk a problem into existence. And we certainly don't want to do that. And what we're doing in this report is saying we see a number of threats on the horizon, and that if we're aware of those threats, then we can put in place the kind of policies to deal with them.
But you offer solutions as well. And
use the mic, please.
Because
identify yourself.
Thank you for the question, because actually that's what puzzled me since the beginning. I'm Thomas, I work for UNIFIL as a civil affairs officer. And at the beginning I thought to ask, then I thought not, but I believe that's the basis of what we're discussing here. I mean, it's not about environment, about polar bears, and about climate change and water. Basically, it's about giving people the opportunity to have a voice. And I do agree with the gentleman here that deep down is how you see in the year of 2020, 2040, 2060 and 70, the role of regimes, how it's going to play out in this region, and this is going to how this is going to impact positively or negatively the changes. Thank you.
My guess is that Ali would say that's not their mandate, that they are not mandated to come and talk about Arab regimes, but it is our mandate. We, the people of the Arab world, it is our responsibility to do that, to talk about why is it that we have government power structures that are sometimes efficient, but sometimes dysfunctional, and occasionally are being indicted in the International Criminal Court. So we have a wide range of government track records in this region, which is very erratic and inconsistent at best. But I think we have to deal with both the technical issues as well as the political issues. In the end, one of our conclusions in the work we're doing in public policy is that you cannot public policy is about the policy of the government, it's also about the rights of the public. We take public policy to mean public rights and government policies, and the two have to be seen together, the link between citizen and state, between the individual and the power structure, the allocation of scarce resources and the utilization of resources by citizens. And you have to really deal with both of those. This is the 20th anniversary of the solidarity movement in Poland. 20 years ago, the people of Poland would have spoken just like we are saying today, that it's hopeless, we live in a dictatorship, we can't make change, the government is corrupt, they do whatever they want, and look at what happened. Poland started a movement by a bunch of electricians in a shipyard, and a couple of years later, the Soviet Empire collapsed. So change will happen. I mean, we're not about political change. We're about public policy and exploring these issues. But I think by providing the best research available from scholars and researchers in this region with the colleagues from around the world, we can bring pressure to bear. And this is really what we have to keep exploring. How do we use this material to keep pushing against the power structure to get them to respond more efficiently? And this is something that is a non-stop process. We keep exploring it.
Maybe just a comment from my side on this. Of course, this is not within the mandate of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to IISD to make a so comprehensive report that would also cover these very broad human rights political issues. But we should not forget that EU and Denmark, including in EU, is having a current and constant discussion with the countries in this region through the various agreements. Lebanon, for example, through the EU association agreement with other countries in the region, similar kind of consultations that go on, and where we push for progress on the human rights within the human rights field. This is an ongoing process. Don't be naive that this can happen from one day to another. I always use Denmark as an example that things don't change overnight. We had our constitution that gave democratic voting rights in 1849 to men. 65 years later, women got the right. I'm always using this as an example. We should not be too patient, but we should also be realistic in our way of looking at how societies and systems change.
Last questions. I think there's the two ladies there. Zena and did you have a question?
Yes.
Okay, the last two, and then we'll stop.
Zena, I'm a faculty member at the Faculty of Health Sciences, Environmental Department. Thank you first for the analysis, and I see that this grouping is really primordial to move the agenda forward. And we know that in Europe we already have 3 ministries of climate change, and that prevention in the region here is not given a high priority, whereas studies have proved that if we start prevention now, it may cut costs around 70%, whereas if we prevent in 2025. We already talked about what can be done regarding policy impact and what societal organizations can we do. And I see that recognizing the efforts of the MFA of Denmark for the study, how Oli Brown could give recommendation of us academicians and scientists to move forward in this agenda to meet the mitigation, adaptation, and vulnerability, not knowing that climate change is affecting vulnerable population first.
I'm sorry, what recommendations would I have to
build on this study that was given, knowing that it's giving really very concrete information of what can be done in 2050, to move since now and knowing that we're conducting efforts with the Issam Fares Institute and other faculty members at the AUB?
Well, I think as Professor Curry was saying, one of the things that needs to be done is to build these groups of academics, policymakers, civil society groups to investigate these issues together and to take them into policy and to share those ideas both within countries and across countries. And one of the things we talk about here is the need for some kind of or more regional approaches to both understanding the impacts of climate change and then understanding the potential benefits of sharing resources and resource efficiency more effectively. There's been a long-running research program in between Jordan, Palestine, and Israel called the GLOA project, which is funded by the German government. But that between those two countries has already encountered quite a lot of difficulty in terms of sharing data, getting access to data. But I think it's those kind of partnerships that need to be really maximised in terms of both understanding the extent of the problems, putting them in context of everything else, and not over-exaggerating the extent of the problem and trying to understand it in the context of the other challenges that every country faces in the region, and then also developing innovative ways of dealing with those problems.
You have a question? Last one, go ahead.
I'm an environmental consultant. A very small question and a little bit of a more elaborate one. The first one is, you had said, the lady on the panel, had said that something along the lines of there is impacts of climate change in Lebanon, like ice density reduction, rain distribution changes, pest variations, what have you. Are those common sense, extrapolations, or are they, facts for modeling and what have you? Is this a fact what you're saying, or it's common sense? Yes, but you use it in your presentation. I'm just wondering.
There are articles in that, and I can provide you with them afterwards. I think you have.
Okay. And the second thing that makes me wonder, if Lebanon is impacted from climate change, is not a causer, as you had said, it's insignificant. And Fuad had said that our governments and our societies are basically useless. Okay, and then there's this big question of why don't our governments install solar panels? My question is, why should we? I'm not against resource management, energy efficiency, water conservation, and protection of the environment. I'm all for it. But why should we work towards stopping climate change rather than stopping the impact on us as a society? There is a distinction there. Thank you.
Well, I think the first point to say is that greenhouse gases produced in Lebanon are the same as greenhouse gases produced in the US. It's all part of a problem. Obviously, the US per capita emissions of greenhouse gases are something like 20 tons, 22 tons, depending on how you judge it, in the US, and the per capita emissions of greenhouse gases here are a little bit higher than the world average. So already Lebanon is producing more than the world average. So again, it's contributing to a problem. The other point I think that we make is that dealing with greenhouse gas emissions here has a very real ancillary benefit in Lebanon. Moving towards renewable energy, as the ambassador was saying, can help deal with the very real energy crisis that Lebanon has. So you have abundant sunshine, you have a potential for wind power, and it's there's scope to find alternative sources of energy. That means that you're not reliant on imports of oil. That as we've seen over the last 2 years, go from $147 a barrel down to $35, back up to $50 a barrel or whatever it is now. So there's a whole series of political and environmental benefits there.
Thank you very much. Before we finish, I just want to, we've run out of time too, we've had more than 2 hours, but we need to, just a couple of things I want to say. We will be following up a lot of these issues, like I said, with our phased program of research and policy assessment at the Issam Fares Institute, looking at different aspects of climate change across the region. So if you're interested, keep in touch with us. The person to contact is Salim Terjajian, who's standing with the microphone. She's the coordinator of our policy program, Research on Policy on Climate Change, and I want to thank her for helping to organize this, and to thank our panelists again and all the institutions that have been involved in this. Thank you for coming.
I wanted just to say that I am from the ISI delegation.
Ah, okay.
And just to say that
No, of course, no, it has to be agreed upon. But not of the energy per ounce, yeah. I've heard different things about that. Hey, very nice to meet you. I've read a lot of your stuff, so thanks for coming. Thank you so much. Well, let me just give you a card. Unfortunately, I leave right now, but it's a pleasure to stay. Thanks for coming. Good luck. Feel free to get in touch. I'll be around to see everyone if you want to.
And we've done some topics before. I'd be interested to discuss a bit further because I mean, it does seem that the country has
yes. It's a brief which we can give you in Arabic and in English. Exactly, yes, exactly that. So put up the main Thank you so much.
يعطيكم العافية ميرسي كثير.
Please, by all means. I'm doing a lot
You're very You're right. طب بجي بشوفك بحكي ترجمة ونخرج فنجانات بسوق. اوكي واذا جودة فاضي معك 3 فول لانه we are I think that's wonderful. We should, come to America.
It's on the table down here.
I have so many files.
tried to push it.
This chapter has been achieved by this time has been made now this is yours. No, I'm going to buy one of those little ones. Another